The crisp October air carried the scent of cut grass and distant wood smoke, the quintessential perfume of suburbia on the cusp of autumn. Frank stood on his new lawn, a patch of emerald perfection he now legally owned, and felt a sense of profound, bone-deep satisfaction. He and a landscaper named Miguel were pacing the property line, their feet leaving dark tracks in the dewy grass. Miguel, a man whose forearms were a testament to years of wrestling with the earth, held a tablet displaying a 3D rendering of their plan. "So, a dozen 6-foot emerald green arborvitae right along here," Miguel said, gesturing toward the boundary separating Frank's yard from the one next door. "Give 'em 2-3 years, and you'll have a solid green wall. Total privacy." Frank nodded, imagining it. A living fence, a soft green barrier that would transform their yard into a private sanctuary for him and his wife, Beth. It was the final touch on their dream, the period at the end of a long, stressful sentence of house hunting. That's the idea, something that feels natural, not like a fortress. "You got it." Miguel tapped his tablet. "I can have the trees delivered Thursday. Start planting Friday morning." "Perfect." A sharp, deliberate click-clack of heels on pavement broke the morning's tranquility. Both men turned. A woman was marching down the adjacent driveway with the unswerving purpose of a drill sergeant. She was impeccably dressed in tailored slacks and a blazer, her blonde hair pulled into a severe bun. In one hand, she held a pristine white clipboard. "Good morning," she said, her voice pleasant, but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. She stopped precisely at the property line, not a single polished loafer straying onto Frank's grass. "Nicole Nelson. I'm the chair of the Architectural Control Committee for the Oakhaven Estates Homeowners Association." Frank offered a neighborly smile. "Frank Collins. We just closed yesterday. It's a pleasure to meet you." Nicole's smile didn't reach her eyes. They flicked from Frank to Miguel, then settled on the tablet. "I couldn't help but overhear your landscaping plans. An ACC inspection was already on my schedule for this property, so this is timely. May I?" She gestured toward the tablet, and Miguel, slightly intimidated, handed it over. Nicole studied the rendering, her expression unreadable. She hummed thoughtfully, a low, clinical sound. "Arborvitae. A popular choice," she commented, as if discussing a lab specimen. "Unfortunately, a hedge of this height and density would constitute a view-obstructing structure, as defined by the governing documents." She handed the tablet back to Miguel. "It would be in direct violation of Article 8, Section 4.2 of the Covenants, conditions and restrictions regarding the preservation of designated view corridors." The jargon was delivered with such practiced ease that Frank felt a momentary sense of disorientation. View corridor. He glanced behind him. His property backed onto a small, wooded common area, a tangle of oaks and maples. The house next door. Nicole's house had the same view. "I'm sorry," Frank said, keeping his tone even. "I'm not sure I understand. A view of what, exactly?" "The common area woodland," Nicole stated, as if it were obvious. "The CC&Rs are designed to maintain the aesthetic harmony and shared natural beauty of the community for all residents. A solid wall of trees would privatize a view that is meant to be communal." The humiliation was subtle, a slow creeping heat. It wasn't a shouting match. It was a procedural execution. In front of the landscaper he'd just hired. He was being dressed down, politely and efficiently, like a child who'd colored outside the lines. He saw Miguel shift his weight, clearly uncomfortable and eager to leave. Frank took a breath, channeling the calm, methodical approach he used for troubleshooting complex IT systems. This was just another system, with rules and protocols. Thank you for the heads up. Nicole, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention before we started. Could you have the management company send me the official notice, citing the relevant article? I'd like to review it with the plat map from my closing documents. A flicker of something surprised respect crossed Nicole's face before being replaced by her mask of serene authority. Of course. We prefer to start with an informal, neighborly conversation before escalating to formal notices. Consider this a courtesy. You'll receive an email from Vesta Management by the end of the day. Welcome to the neighborhood, Mr. Collins. With a final, sharp nod, she turned and click-clacked back up her driveway, the clipboard held firmly at her side. Miguel let out a low whistle. Wow, she's official. Frank managed a weak smile. Yeah, looks like it. He felt a knot of unease tighten in his stomach. It wasn't just about the trees anymore. It was about the clipboard, the jargon, and the unnerving feeling that he had just failed his first test as a homeowner. That evening, the scent of takeout pizza did little to dispel the tension in their new, sparsely furnished dining room. Beth, her nurse's scrubs replaced by a comfortable sweater, listened intently as Frank recounted the morning's encounter. A view corridor, she asked, her brow furrowed. To see the same patch of woods we see. That doesn't make sense. That's what she said, and she knew the exact article and section of the CC&Rs by heart. Frank picked at the crust of his pizza. It felt rehearsed. They had sacrificed so much for this house. For 2 years, they had funneled every spare dollar into savings, giving up vacations, dining out, and the small luxuries that make a stressful life bearable. Frank's steady income from his IT job and Beth's grueling shifts as an ER nurse had been poured into the singular goal of owning a piece of Oakhaven Estates. The housing market had been a bloodbath of bidding wars and all-cash offers. But then, this house, 124 Willow Lane, had appeared like a miracle. It was beautiful, well-maintained, and priced just below market. It had belonged to an elderly woman, Dorothy Miller, who had passed away earlier in the year. Her nephew, living out of state, had been keen to sell quickly. The garden she'd left behind was a masterpiece of perennial beds and flowering shrubs, a silent testament to a life spent nurturing beauty. Frank and Beth felt a connection to her, a sense of stewardship for the home she had so clearly loved. Remember the closing documents, Beth said suddenly. Getting up from the table, she returned a moment later with the thick accordion file from the title company. She sifted through the stack of papers, the deed, the survey, the title insurance, until she found the thickest document of all the covenants, conditions, and restrictions for the Oakhaven Estates HOA. Here, she said, flipping to a page bookmarked with a small yellow sticky note. A single paragraph was neatly highlighted in yellow ink. Beth read it aloud. Article 8, Landscape and Architectural Control. Section 8.4.2, View corridors. No fence, wall, hedge, or mass planting shall be erected or maintained in a location or at a height that unreasonably obstructs the view of designated common areas or natural features from an adjacent lot. Beth tapped the highlighted text. That's odd. The seller's agent made a point of highlighting this. He said something about it being a standard clause for lots backing onto the common area. At the time, they had dismissed it. It seemed like procedural boilerplate, a minor detail in a mountain of paperwork. Now, the highlighted words seemed to glow with a new, ominous significance. Someone had wanted them to see this. Dorothy's nephew, the agent. It was a breadcrumb, a clue they hadn't known they needed to follow. It says, unreasonably obstructs, Frank mused, rereading the text. That's subjective. Who decides what's unreasonable? I have a feeling, Beth said, closing the binder with a soft thud, That we just met her this morning. The friendly, informal warning Nicole had mentioned was a fiction. Before they even finished their pizza, an email with a sterile, official header pinged in Frank's inbox. From Vesta Property Management subject. Courtesy notice potential. CCNR violation. 124 Willow Lane. The email was cloyingly polite. A masterclass in passive-aggressive bureaucracy. It referenced his conversation with the ACC chair and formally cited Par 8.4.2. It requested that he submit a revised landscaping plan within 10 business days to avoid the issuance of a formal notice of violation. Frank stared at the screen. The speed, the efficiency, the seamless transition from a neighborly chat to a documented warning. It was chilling. The knot in his stomach tightened. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a process, and it was just beginning. The certified letter arrived a week later. Its green and white sticker, a stark announcement of officialdom. Frank had to sign for it at the door. The mail carrier's electronic stylus recording his reluctant acknowledgement. It was the formal notice of violation. He had submitted a revised plan online, proposing shorter, less dense plantings. But it had been rejected within hours, with a one-line explanation. Plan does not adequately preserve the designated view corridor. The letter was a procedural escalation. It felt impersonal and threatening, citing fines that would begin to accrue if the violation was not cured within 14 days. The language was cold, legalistic, and designed to intimidate. The stakes were no longer social. They were financial. Their dream home was beginning to feel like a legal trap. Beth read the letter over his shoulder, her hand resting on his arm. This is insane. Frank, she's treating our desire for a little privacy like it's a federal crime. It's not about the privacy, Frank said, his mind already shifting into problem-solving mode. It's about control. She's testing us. He spent the next few days preparing, not for a fight, but for a logical presentation. He believed, perhaps naively, that the system, however flawed, would respond to reason. He printed out his revised plans, took photographs of the view corridor from multiple angles on his property and Nicole's, and even prepared a short presentation comparing his proposed hedge to other larger plantings throughout the neighborhood. He was determined to be the most reasonable man in the room. The room, it turned out, was a small, soulless conference space in the community clubhouse, furnished with a long laminate table and 8 uncomfortable chairs. The air was stale with the smell of old coffee and institutional cleaner. Frank was the only homeowner present. The Architectural Control Committee consisted of 3 people, Nicole Nelson, seated at the head of the table, and 2 older residents, a man and a woman, who flanked her like silent sentinels. They offered weak, apologetic smiles as he entered. Mr. Collins, Nicole began, her voice echoing slightly in the empty room. Thank you for attending. We have reviewed your second submission. However, the committee finds that it still fails to comply with the spirit and letter of Article 8. Frank launched into his carefully prepared presentation. He laid out the photos, explained the modest height of his proposed shrubs, and pointed to precedent on other properties. He was calm, respectful, and relentlessly logical. Nicole listened with an expression of practiced patience, her hands steepled before her. When he finished, she didn't address any of his points directly. Instead, she employed a strategy of procedural attrition. While we appreciate your diligence, Frank, may I call you Frank, the committee's decisions are not based solely on height or density, but on the principle of aesthetic harmony, she said, her tone condescendingly gentle. One of her acolytes, the woman, nodded vigorously. The historical precedent for this specific property line has been an unobstructed vista. Nicole continued. To approve your plan would set a new, undesirable precedent that could negatively impact the cohesive visual character of the community. But the CC&Rs use the word unreasonable, Frank countered. How is a 5-foot hedge unreasonable when there's a 7-foot stockade fence 2 houses down? Nicole smiled, a thin, triumphant curve of her lips. That fence was grandfathered in prior to the 2015 amendments, an entirely different set of regulations. As a new owner, you are subject to the current governing documents in their entirety. She deliberately mispronounced his last name. Mr. Collis. The committee's decision is final. Your plan is rejected. The 2 other members murmured their assent, their eyes avoiding his. It was a sham. He had walked in thinking it was a hearing. It was a sentencing. He had come armed with logic. But she was armed with absolute power. As he packed his materials, a sense of cold fury began to replace his frustration. He had followed the rules, made his case, and been dismissed by a jargon-spouting tyrant. He realized then that this fight wouldn't be won in committee meetings or by submitting revised plans. If he wanted to save his home from this procedural siege, he would have to understand the system better than she did. He would have to find the flaw in her code. The first rule of troubleshooting is to gather data. Frank, an IT architect, lived by this principle. His battle with Nicole Nelson was no longer a landscaping dispute. It was a system with a critical error, and he was determined to find the root cause. His investigation began not in the sterile offices of the management company, but in the dusty, quiet archives of the county recorder's office. Surrounded by the faint, papery scent of old documents and the low hum of microfilm readers, he felt a sense of purpose. He requested the official plat map for the Oakhaven Estates development. Lot D, Section 2, his property. When the clerk handed him the large, crackling sheet of paper, he spread it out on a lighted table. There, in precise, unforgiving black ink, were the lines that defined his world. He traced the boundaries of his lot. 124 Willow Lane, and the adjacent one, Nicole's. Behind both was a larger, irregularly shaped parcel labeled Lot C, common area. Then he saw it. A faint, dotted line ran along the edge of the common area, but it stopped short of his property line. Next to the dotted line was a small notation, View Corridor Easement, per deed, U78451B. The easement, the legal basis for Nicole's entire argument, appeared to be attached to Lot C, the common land, not his private property. It was the first crack in her fortress of certainty. Next, he pulled the deed itself. 78451B. The legal description was a dense block of text, a dizzying string of meets and bounds. But the language was clear to anyone patient enough to decipher it. The easement was granted by the Oakhaven Estates Homeowners Association to the benefit of the adjacent lots for the purpose of maintaining a natural view. But its physical domain was explicitly defined as being within the boundaries of Lot C. His property was Lot D. The seed of a powerful truth began to sprout in his mind. Nicole was enforcing a rule on his property that had no legal jurisdiction there. His heart hammered against his ribs. It was a rookie mistake on her part, an overreach born of arrogance. She was counting on no one ever checking the source documents. That evening, energized by his discovery, he sat at his computer and drafted an email to the property management company. A polite but pointed inquiry. He asked for clarification on the jurisdiction of the Borrower 8.4.2 easement, subtly hinting at his findings at the recorder's office. He didn't show his whole hand, but he let them know he was looking at the cards. 2 days later, an anonymous email appeared in his inbox. The sender address was a jumble of random letters and numbers from a secure, encrypted service. The message was short and cryptic. Subject: Willow Lane. She's not protecting a view. She's settling a score. Check the easement deeds for the common area behind your lot. And ask Vesta Management for the ACC meeting minutes from May 2021. They won't want to give them to you. Frank's blood ran cold. Someone else knew. Someone was watching. And they were on his side. The email confirmed his own discovery about the easement deed and gave him a new target: the May 2021 minutes. He immediately sent a formal request to Vesta Management for the minutes, as was his right as a homeowner. The response was telling. The manager, a woman named Carol, replied that the minutes from that specific month were currently under review by legal counsel and were unavailable. A blatant lie, and a telling one. They were hiding something. Frank spent the next 2 weeks in a frustrating back and forth with Vesta, formally citing the sections of the HOA bylaws that guaranteed homeowners access to records. Finally, under threat of a formal complaint, they relented and sent him a PDF of the minutes from the May 2021 ACC meeting. He opened the file, his breath held in anticipation. He scrolled down the page, past the procedural opening and approval of the previous month's minutes. Then, he found the agenda item he was looking for: New Business Discussion of Property Line Adjustment. 124 Willow Lane. But the details were gone. The entire section, a block of text nearly half a page long, was covered by a thick, black digital redaction box. It was a digital wall, a deliberate and blatant act of concealment. Whatever had happened in that meeting regarding Dorothy Miller's property, the board did not want him or anyone else to see it. This was no longer just about a bully with a clipboard. This was a cover-up. The black box was a challenge for Frank, whose career was built on navigating complex systems and uncovering hidden data. It was an irresistible puzzle. He now had two undeniable facts: the view easement didn't apply to his lot, and the HOA was actively concealing a past discussion about his property's former owner. The two had to be connected. The midpoint twist, the piece of information that would reframe the entire conflict, arrived in his inbox 2 nights later from the same anonymous source. It was another short, direct message. Subject: unredacted. They think a PDF redaction is secure. It isn't. Attached was a single file: ACC Minutes, May 2021, UNR, PDF. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The document looked identical to the one Vesta had sent, with one crucial difference. The black box was gone. The text beneath it was stark and revealing. New Business Discussion of Property Line Adjustment. 124 Willow Lane. ACC Chair, N. Nelson proposed the association make an offer to homeowner D. Miller to purchase a 10-foot wide strip of land along the rear property line of 124 Willow Lane. The stated purpose was to create a formal walking path, providing direct access from Ms. Nelson's property to the community trail in the common area. Ms. Nelson presented an offer amount of $500. A letter from homeowner D. Miller was read into the record, in which she emphatically declined a similar private offer from Ms. Nelson and stated she had no intention of selling any portion of her property, which she considered a blatant attempt at a land grab. Motion to make an offer was made by J. Smith, seconded by L. N. Kent. After discussion, the motion failed for lack of a majority vote. Chair Nelson noted her strong disagreement with the outcome for the record. Frank read it 3 times, the words burning themselves into his brain. It was all there. This had never, ever been about a view. It was a personal vendetta. Nicole had wanted a piece of Dorothy Miller's land to create a private shortcut for herself. When Dorothy, a woman of evident principle, had refused and publicly embarrassed her by calling it a land grab in an official meeting. Nicole had lost, but she hadn't forgotten. Her entire campaign against Frank's hedge was a spiteful, posthumous punishment directed at the property she could not control. She was using the full power of her ACC position to harass the new owner of the land she coveted, wielding a non-existent rule as her weapon of choice. It was a breathtaking abuse of power, fueled by a petty, 2-year-old grudge. Armed with this undeniable proof, Frank felt a surge of righteous anger. He now had the truth, and the truth was a powerful weapon. He spent the next hour carefully composing an email to the entire HOA board of directors, CCing the Vesta property manager. He attached the surveyor's report confirming the easement did not apply to his lot. He attached the unredacted minutes. His tone was polite, but firm, laying out the evidence of Nicole's personal conflict of interest and her malicious enforcement of a non-existent rule. He concluded by formally requesting that the notice of violation be rescinded immediately and that the board investigate the ACC chair for malfeasance. He hit send and leaned back in his chair, a profound sense of vindication washing over him. He had found the system error. He had exposed the truth. Surely, this would be the end of it. He was wrong. It was the beginning of the real war. Nicole Nelson did not respond to the evidence with contrition or retreat. She responded with overwhelming force. Frank's meticulously documented email, which he had expected to be a checkmate, was instead treated as a declaration of war. He had underestimated the ferocity of a petty tyrant whose authority had been publicly challenged. The first counterattack came not from Nicole, but from the HOA's legal counsel. Frank received a terse, formal letter stating that the board had full confidence in its committee chairs and that homeowner obtained documents of questionable origin, referring to the unredacted minutes, would not be considered. The letter went on to state that his failure to cure the violation had resulted in the levying of the first fine $100 due in 30 days. It was a slap in the face. A clear message from the board: we are closing ranks, and you are on the outside. Then, Nicole's personal campaign of microaggressions began. She seemed to be everywhere, a constant, monitoring presence. Every morning, as Frank left for work, he would see her standing by her window, notepad in hand. The violation notices started arriving like clockwork, 2 or 3 a week, for infractions so minor they bordered on the absurd. Notice of violation: waste receptacle placement. Per Community Rule 7.c, waste receptacles may not be placed at the curb prior to 6 hours p.m. on the evening before collection. Your receptacle was observed at the curb at 5:48 p.m. on Tuesday, October 24th. Notice of violation: nuisance fluid leak. A stain consistent with an automotive fluid leak, approximately 3 inches in diameter, was observed on your driveway during a routine inspection. Please remediate to maintain community aesthetic standards. Each notice was a paper cut, a small sting designed to bleed him slowly. They were all technically legitimate, based on some obscure rule buried deep in the community handbook. But the enforcement was clearly selective and malicious. Frank saw a dozen other trash cans out early on his street, and nearly every driveway had a small oil spot. Only he was being cited. The pressure began to take a toll. The constant stream of official, threatening mail created a cloud of anxiety that settled over their home. Beth, who worked from home several days a week, found her concentration shattered every time the mail carrier's truck rumbled down the street. She felt a jolt of dread. One evening, after Frank found yet another violation notice, this time for improper hose storage tucked into his front door, the strain finally boiled over. "I can't live like this, Frank," Beth said, her voice strained. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. "It feels like we're under siege. I can't relax in my own house. She's winning, She's sucking all the joy out of this place we worked so hard for. We can't just give in. Beth, Frank argued, his own frustration making his voice sharp. That's what she wants. If we let her win on this, she'll never stop. Then, what's the alternative? She shot back, her eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and despair. Living in a constant state of anxiety, spending thousands on lawyers. Frank, is this fight worth the damage it's doing to us, to our peace of mind? Right now, let's set a limit. If we can't resolve this by the annual meeting next month, we need to seriously consider our options. Maybe we just sell. The word sell hung in the air between them, a bespoke possibility. To give up their dream home, to let Nicole win, it felt like a profound failure. But looking at Beth's exhausted face, Frank knew the cost of this fight was becoming unbearable. The annual meeting was in 3 weeks. It was his deadline. The final escalation, the move that pushed Frank past the point of no return, arrived via certified mail a week before the meeting. It was a thick envelope from the HOA's law firm. Inside was a formal notice of intent to place a lien on their property for $400 in unpaid. Escalating fines. A lien. The word was a legal cudgel, a threat that struck at the very heart of their ownership. If they didn't pay, the HOA could, in theory, eventually foreclose on their home. Staring at the legal document, with its cold, unforgiving print, Frank felt the last of his desire for compromise evaporate. This was no longer a dispute. It was an existential threat to his family's future. Nicole had weaponized the full bureaucratic power of the HOA to try and break him. The annual meeting was no longer just a deadline. It was the battlefield where this war would be won or lost. He had 3 weeks to prepare his counteroffensive. He would not be the one to retreat. The Oakhaven Estates annual HOA meeting was held in the local middle school auditorium, a cavernous room that smelled of floor wax and adolescent angst. Nearly 200 homeowners sat in the tiered, uncomfortable plastic seats, a captive audience for the droning recitation of the year's financial reports and committee updates. On stage, at a long table draped in a burgundy cloth, sat the 5-member board of directors. Nicole Nelson, as president, was seated in the center, a portrait of civic authority. Frank sat in the 3rd row, a slim leather portfolio resting on his lap. Beside him, Beth gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. In the weeks leading up to this night, he had worked with the single-minded focus of a man preparing for trial. He had spoken with Mr. Henderson, an elderly neighbor who had been friends with Dorothy Miller. Mr. Henderson had confirmed Nicole's long-standing animosity toward Dorothy. Dorothy fought her too, the old man had said, his voice thin but firm. She stood up to Nicole at meetings, called her out for misinterpreting the rules. Fighting for your home is fighting for her memory. Frank, but do it with integrity. Don't become the bully you're trying to stop. Mr. Henderson's words had become his moral compass. During his research into Nicole's selective enforcement, Frank had discovered that Mr. Henderson's own fence was technically in violation of a minor rule. A few sections were slightly discolored and needed restaining. It was an easy fix, the kind of thing a neighborly note could solve. Nicole, in her crusade against Frank, had ignored this actual, albeit trivial, violation completely. Frank now held that information, a weapon he had to decide how or if to use. Finally, after an hour of procedural monotony, Nicole stepped to the lectern. We now come to the open forum portion of our meeting. Homeowners who have signed up to speak will have 5 minutes. The time will be displayed on the screen. A large digital timer on a projector screen behind her lit up, its red numbers glowing 500. Our first and only speaker this evening is Mr. Frank Collins of 124 Willow Lane, she announced, her tone dripping with condescension. Mr. Collins has some concerns he'd like to share. Frank walked to the stage, placed his laptop on the lectern, and connected it to the projector. He took a deep breath, the faces of his neighbors a blur before him. He could feel Nicole's glare from the table. The timer started its silent, inexorable countdown. 4:59, 4:58. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady and clear, amplified by the microphone. "My name is Frank Collins. My wife and I bought our home here 4 months ago because we love this community. But our experience has been defined by a pattern of targeted harassment from our ACC, led by President Nelson." A murmur rippled through the audience. The timer read 4:30. "This harassment centers on a claim that my plan to plant a privacy hedge violates Article 8.4.2, the View Corridor Rule." He clicked a button, and the text of FAR 8.4.2 filled the screen. "I was told this rule prevents me from planting on my private property. But rules must have a legal basis in the documents that govern us all." Another click. A crisp, color-coded image of the official county plat map appeared on the screen. He used a laser pointer to trace the boundaries. "As you can see from the certified plat map, I am on Lot D, the View Corridor easement, according to the official county deed, applies exclusively to the common area, which is Lot C." He superimposed the legal text from the deed over the map. "The ACC has been fining me and has threatened to place a lien on my home for violating a rule that does not exist on my property." The murmurs grew louder. People were leaning forward, looking at the screen, then at a stone-faced Nicole. 2:59, 2:58. "You might wonder why," Frank continued, his voice calm and deliberate. "Why would the ACC president pursue a baseless violation so aggressively?" Click. The unredacted minutes from the May 2021 meeting filled the screen. The crucial paragraph highlighted, "Because this was never about a view. It was about a personal grudge." I have here the unredacted minutes from a meeting where Ms. Nelson attempted to have the HOA acquire a portion of the previous owner's property, Dorothy Miller's property, after Ms. Miller refused to sell it to her privately for a pittance. Gasps echoed through the auditorium. Nicole stood up abruptly. "This is out of order. These documents are unverified, and this is slander." But another board member, a man at the end of the table, held up a hand. "Let him speak. Nicole, he has the floor." Nicole sat down, her face a mask of fury. The timer showed 1:55. "This is a documented case of selective enforcement, rooted in a personal conflict of interest," Frank said, turning to his moral dilemma. He looked out into the audience and found Mr. Henderson's face. "To prove the selective nature of this enforcement, I could stand here and point to actual, minor violations on the properties of our neighbors, good people who our president has chosen to ignore in her single-minded pursuit of me. For example, my research revealed a minor aesthetic issue on Mr. Henderson's property that has been overlooked for months." Mr. Henderson looked up, his expression startled. Frank met his gaze. "But, unlike our president, I believe our role as neighbors is to help each other, not to hunt for infractions to use as leverage. I will not be filing a complaint against my neighbor. That's not what community is about." He saw Mr. Henderson give a slow, grateful nod. A wave of approval rippled through the crowd. He had demonstrated his character, and in doing so, had annihilated Nicole's. The timer read 0:30. "This isn't about a hedge," Frank concluded, his voice ringing with conviction. "It's about a documented abuse of power that has cost my family our peace, and has cost this community its integrity. I have filed a formal complaint with our management company. And I am asking you, my neighbors, to support a motion for a full, independent audit of all ACC decisions made under Ms. Nelson's leadership for the past 2 years. He stepped away from the lectern as the timer flashed 000. The auditorium was silent for a beat, a collective intake of breath. Then, it erupted, not in chaos, but in a groundswell of focused anger. The uproar was not the disorganized shouting of a mob, but the focused, procedural anger of homeowners who finally understood they had been deceived. Before Nicole or the stunned board members on stage could regain control, a respected, longtime resident named George Sobel stood up from the front row. I make a motion to censure the president for malfeasance and to authorize an immediate, independent audit of the Architectural Control Committee, with the findings to be presented at a special meeting, he declared, his voice booming through the auditorium. Second came a chorus of voices. The interim board member who had allowed Frank to speak called for a vote. A forest of hands shot up in favor. When he asked for the nays, only one hand was raised, Nicole's. She sat isolated at the long table, her allies looking at their shoes, the floor, anywhere but at her. The representative from Vesta Management, a woman who had been watching the proceedings with growing horror, quickly took the microphone. In light of this motion and the presented evidence, she announced, her voice trembling slightly, Vesta Management is effective immediately, rescinding all fines and withdrawing the intent to lien against the property at 124 Willow Lane, pending the outcome of the audit. The meeting dissolved as neighbors surged around Frank, shaking his hand, patting him on the back. They were telling their own stories of Nicole, of petty notices, of oddly denied requests, of a general atmosphere of intimidation they had never been able to prove. The pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place for everyone at once. Frank had not just fought for his own home, he had liberated the entire neighborhood. Nicole Nelson sat alone on the stage, a queen deposed. Watching the community she had ruled through fear and procedure unite against her. The power she had so carefully cultivated had vanished in 5 short minutes. In the weeks that followed, the foundation of Nicole's suburban empire crumbled completely. The audit revealed a clear pattern of arbitrary enforcement and favoritism, faced with overwhelming evidence and a community in open revolt. Nicole and 2 of her most loyal board members tendered their resignations. A special election was called, and a new board was swept into power on a platform of transparency and reform. Frank, reluctantly at first, agreed to chair a new oversight committee, tasked with rewriting some of the more ambiguous community rules to prevent future abuses. One crisp evening, a few days after the special election, Frank was in his front yard, raking the last of the autumn leaves. A man he didn't recognize walked up his driveway. He was in his late 40s, with a kind, intelligent face and the weary look of someone who had carried a heavy burden for a long time. "Frank Collins," the man asked. "Yes." "My name is David Miller." The name struck Frank with the force of a physical blow. Miller. He stared, speechless. "I believe you received a few emails from me," David said with a small, sad smile. "Dorothy was my aunt. I'm a forensic accountant by trade. After she passed, I knew something wasn't right. She told me about the harassment, about Nicole. I've been investigating her for almost 2 years. It was him, the anonymous helper, the guardian angel who had guided him through the labyrinth." David explained everything. He had been waiting for the right person to buy his aunt's house, someone with the fortitude and resources to fight back. He had researched Frank and Beth before they even made an offer, seeing in them the champions his late aunt deserved. He had guided Frank to the evidence, but had been careful to let Frank find the courage to use it himself. Justice for Dorothy, he explained, needed to come from the community she had loved, not just from a grieving nephew. Then came the final, constructive surprise. "My aunt was a fighter," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "In her will, she set aside a portion of her estate for a specific purpose. She wanted to help her neighbors." He handed Frank a business card for a lawyer. "I'm using those funds to establish the Dorothy Miller Community Legal Defense Fund. It's a legal aid resource for homeowners here and in other communities who are facing predatory actions from their HOA boards. Her legacy won't be that she was a victim. It will be that she is a protector." A week later, Miguel's truck pulled up to the curb. He and his crew unloaded a dozen beautiful, healthy emerald green arborvitae. Frank and Beth stood by, watching as the trees were placed one by one into the earth along their property line. Each tree was a small victory, a green testament to their perseverance, as the last one was set in place, creating the soft, living wall of privacy they had dreamed of. Frank looked over at Nicole Nelson's house. The windows were dark. A for sale sign was staked into the lawn. He put his arm around Beth, pulling her close. They had their sanctuary. They had their home. And Dorothy Miller, in the end, had her justice.